Since its launch in 2005, Broad Street Review has sought to promote the exchange of viewpoints rather than any particular point of view. To that end, we welcome commentary from professionals and amateurs alike about the performing and visual arts, as well as any other field of interest to our eclectic group of contributors. The following interview was submitted to Broad Street Review, powered by Rep Radio.
My name is Paige Price. I'm the producing artistic director here, and we just thought it would be fun to add to the programming today and bring some fun people in. They're all smart, they're all really fun, and the two on the end I'm just going to keep an eye on because...
Because we've been drinking.
Yes. But first, let me introduce our moderator today. Jackie Goldfinger, right in the center here.
Yeah.
Philly-based playwright, dramaturg, and teaching artist. She's got a jillion plays, a jillion awards, but I'm just going to give you three, and then there's bios that you can all read. But her plays include Bottlefly, which is currently nominated for a Blackburn Prize. When do we find out?
January.
Oh my God, January. It'll be on the website. The Arsonists, also nominated for the Blackburn Prize. Developed in the halls of Kennedy Center, La Mama International Writers Conference, the Azuka Theater, and many more. Click. And, well, just so much more. She's sharp, she's funny, she's smart, and who's sitting there?
I think they thought you might want to stay.
Oh, no, I want to watch. All right, I'll sit, sure.
Oh, good.
Okay?
Yeah.
No, I want to go watch. So move over.
Okay.
We could auction off this seat. Anybody want to make a donation, we'll put you on the end seat. Okay, here you go. Have a great time. I'm going to go watch.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening to discuss an issue that I know has been of both local and national importance. I just want to let you know who's on the panel. I'm not going to read their full biographies because those are available in your program, but just so you have an idea. We have Wendy Rosenfeld, who for probably most of you needs no introduction, who is the editor-in-chief of the Broad Street Review, based here in Philadelphia. We have John Moore, who's the senior arts journalist for the Denver Center for the Performing Arts. We have the fantastic John Timpane, who taught me more at the pre-show wine and cheese about radio than I could ever have imagined, so thank you for that. And John Timpane you'll recognize from the Philadelphia Inquirer as a theater critic, books editor, and he also does some of the fine arts reporting. And then we also have Chris Jones, who's the chief theater critic and the Sunday culture columnist for the Chicago Tribune, and Michael Riedel, the theater columnist for the New York Post. So please help me welcome them to Philadelphia. So we thought we'd start out because all of you began your careers in different places and at different times in kind of the arc of American journalism. So we thought we'd start out by asking, when did you begin writing for theater, and what was your practice in the culture at that time? Wendy, do you mind if I start with you, since you're on that end?
Yeah, I started in the mid-1990s at Philadelphia Weekly, which I don't think is around anymore, as of pretty recently. I was a copy editor and doing a little bit of freelance writing, and I had sort of started there as a copy editor in order to position myself should a critic spot open, and because I really wanted to do it. And so the theater critic spot opened, and I had studied some theater in college and literature. So I jumped into that spot, and it worked out, and now it's been 20 plus years, and I had worked at the Inquirer. John was my editor for a little while, but so it has changed. So yeah, and then now I'm at Broad Street Review. I left the Inquirer and am just doing Broad Street Review all the time now.
And that's something we'll get into later, but you jumped from a daily publication to an online.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that a little later. It's exciting. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm John Moore. I, for better for worse, probably have Frank Rich to blame for my presence on the panel. For those of you who don't know, notorious critic for the New York Times was called the Butcher of Broadway, and he actually gave me the advice that I needed to become the theater critic at the Denver Post in 2001. I was already at the newspaper, and the theater critic left, and I was asked to be sort of the temporary theater critic for 2 months while they conducted a national search. And during that 2 months of conducting the national search, they didn't interview anybody. So at the end of those 2 months,
to come.
there you go. At the end of those 2 months, they asked me if I wanted to give it a ride, and I had a life in the theater, but I hadn't had any experience as a theater critic. So on the very day that they offered me the job, I had an interview scheduled to do a story on Frank Rich, who was coming to Denver to do a tour for his book Ghostlight. And we did the interview went fine. And then at the end of the interview, Frank was like, who are you anyway? I know who all the critics are, and I don't know who you are. And so I told him my quick story, and I said, as a matter of fact, right before I talked to you, they offered me the job. And he said, well, are you going to take it? And I said, no, I have way too much respect for the professional theater critics. And he said, so you've been doing it for 2 months? And I said, yeah. And he said, send me some links. And I said, this is great. I'll send him a couple links. Frank Rich, the Butcher of Broadway, is going to tell me to respect the craft and run away and let them hire somebody to do it who knows what they're doing. But he called me back just a matter of hours later, and he said, John, don't not do it because you don't think you're good enough. He said, don't do it if you don't think you can handle the life that goes along with being a professional theater critic. And that means in a city like Denver, you're not just the reviewer, you're also the person who writes the news of the beat, you write the features. You've got to have a relationship with the theater community in a way that Frank Rich never had to have, because all he could do was be a ghost. And so with that encouragement, I kind of said, oh, well, maybe I should give this a shot. And I did it for 12 years, enjoyed it for the most part very much. Newspaper jobs are dying. I'm sure we're going to get into this in the conversation, but newspaper jobs are going away at a rate faster than the coal industry right now. And the writing was on the wall. So at the Post, everybody I know there has taken a buyout offer at one time or another. I left the Post in 2012. After a year of being away, the Denver Center for the Performing Arts gave me a call, and they said, do you want to be a part of the solution? And, that's a bold statement, but it's not the solution, but it's the new journalism. They essentially hired me to do what I was doing at the Denver Post, be a journalist, start my own arts and culture media site covering theater in Colorado for a project that's subsidized by the Denver Center. It's the new journalism, meaning you have to find new sources of funding for this kind of thing. So I don't review shows anymore, but I'm very active. I'm still the only full-time theater journalist in Denver. I just write on a different platform, and that platform it's gray because it's through the Denver Center for the Performing Arts. So that's my transition.
So cool.
Fantastic. I think that Mike's. Thank you. Awesome. Please.
Well, back in 1970, when I was in undergraduate school, I just started freelancing reviews. And then I became a professor in 81, teaching Shakespeare, and I sort of switched over to doing reviews of both books and productions of Shakespeare, but they weren't good or bad. They were mostly concept. They're trying to say, well, here's how these people imagined King Lear, or imagined As You Like It. Here was the production. Here's what they were trying to do with it, as far as I could tell. And I did that for about, and also continued to freelance until I came to the Inquirer in 97.
Thank you.
So I've had my current job for about 15 years. I'm a traditional critic at a big newspaper. I go to the theater pretty much every night of my life, and truly I do. And cover Chicago, Broadway. It's still a big deal at my paper. It's a somewhat smaller deal than maybe, I don't know. It's still a pretty big deal. We're a big theater town, and I find that most people get that. And so I have a fun job for the most part. I started working for Variety. I started when I was in grad school, and I was in Ohio, and I wrote to the then theater editor at Variety, who was called Dick Humler at the time, who went by the moniker of Hum at the end of his reviews, and died in his apartment and nobody found him, which is another story. And my first review was of a play by Reynolds Price at the Cleveland Playhouse, which I still remember as being a fabulous show. And I got paid by the inch. So you get your ruler out and you find out how big the story was, and then they literally, you get a little invoice in the mail and it would say 6.7 inches, $120 or something like that. Probably more than people get paid now, actually. And so I then started working for them, and I became their sort of out-of-town theater guy. I sort of reviewed tryouts all across the country, and I was their main. I reported on an industry called the Broadway Road, as it was then known, still sort of around, although not like it was. And I did that for sort of a decade, slightly more than a decade, and then I got the job at the Tribune when my predecessor, Richard Christensen, retired. And I've been there for 15 years, and here I am.
My career is a little improbable because I was studying history at school, and I was going to be a lawyer. And in the suite where I lived, there were a lot of other people who were studying to be lawyers, history majors, and political science. Everybody was majoring in political science back in the 80s. And they were very intense and humorless and were obsessed with the LSATs. Across the hall were these people who wore black, smoked a lot of pot, and drank cheap red wine. And they were the theater department. And they were more fun. So I started hanging out with them, and I never got around to taking the LSAT until years later, but I remember I had nothing to do the Monday after my graduation. I was in New York, but I had no job and no prospect of a job. And at a party, I met one of these kooky theater people, and they had just taken a job as the editor of a tiny little magazine called Theater Week, and asked me if I would like to be the managing editor. I didn't know anything about journalism. I didn't know anything about the theater. I still don't. But it sounded like fun, and I took it. And what I thought would be a summer job turned out to be a job that lasted 3 years. But my career really began with Frank Rich as well, because he had a girlfriend at the time named Alex Witchell, and he was trying to keep it secret. But she lived across the hall from a friend of mine. And his friend...
So this is blackmail you're talking about.
Well, Alex had just gotten the job at the New York Times as the powerful Friday theater columnist when they had a Friday theater column. Guess who got her the job? But we didn't know it at the time. Frank Rich. And I remember my friend across the hall said, yeah, she comes home with this heavyset guy who has trouble getting up the stairs. I said, describe him. And it was Frank Rich. So not knowing anything about journalism or libel or defamation, I started writing columns about how Frank Rich has gotten to this other powerful job at the Times, the Friday theater columnist, this woman he's sleeping with named Alex Witchell. That blew up. They tried to sue me. I had no money. I had nothing to lose. So I leaked all the threatening letters from their lawyers to Cindy Adams at the Post and Liz Smith at the Daily News and New York Magazine. And I went from being a nobody to being a somebody. And the Daily News hired me.
Lovely.
So that happened. Yes. Great. So what we have is we have this fantastic spectrum of experience in the panel that Paige put together. And I'm curious to hear both from Wendy and John, who have gone the more online route, to those of you still in paper publications, what are the changes that you see in the industry, both in the technical aspect of the industry, publishing online, having to tweet through social media, and how do you get your thoughts down to that short? But also in terms of the quality and what you look at and think about and write about, and how that has changed throughout your transition, and how you think that's going to continue to change. Yes,
Yeah, okay. So when I started, the Philadelphia Inquirer had 2 full-time theater critics, and I remember thinking, that's someday, I'm going to have that job. And I had the misfortune of starting my career as it went from 2 critics to 1 critic to no, just freelancers. So that job disappeared. And so online, the difference is I'm finding that I'm using social media for so much of the sourcing for my stories. This is not the reviewing. The reviewing is basically the same, except that now I'm also doing layout and and putting everything online myself. And when my critic, when my critics send me things and I'm editing them and laying them out, so I'm sort of doing a little bit of everything at this point. So that's a huge difference from sending something to John and being done with it,
Right.
But I am sourcing a lot of my stories. My last 3 columns, I think, have come from Facebook conversations that, just built and built. It's been great in that way, but it's you spend so much time on social media and it's work now, and you have to build up a following. We track where we get our clicks from. Most of them come from Facebook. So it's a really different landscape. I mean, before, you just write it and leave it there and people would read it and that would be that.
Does that affect how you change the stories you pursue?
A little bit. I mean, again, the reviewing is the reviewing. But the stories that I pursue, it seems that people are really interested in the controversies that are going on in the theater world in Philly, really interested in them. And so that's sort of what I'm poking around for, I'm looking to see what people are talking about, how they're talking about it, and to bring it up for a wider, to sort of consolidate that conversation and put it together and leave it there for the wider audience to take in.
And the Broad Street Review has become known as this kind of radical inclusivity, right? Like you and a lot of your writers do scout Facebook and social media and find out what different parts of the community are talking about in relation to one central conversation, which I think is interesting, and I think that expands the conversation in a lot of ways to communities that did not talk to each other. You guys encourage those communities to talk to one another. But that also can narrow the frame, because that means you're narrowing your frame of reference to whoever's talking on social media. So do you ever worry about that or think about that in terms of...
Well, it's funny. We've sort of we've built our reputation by narrowing our focus. Initially, when I took over, we were covering just sort of anything, anywhere. And I said, no, I want to focus it on Philly. So by doing that, I think we've increased our readership. Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's 177%, something crazy like that, just by focusing it on local coverage. So, yes, I'm a little worried about doing just the Facebook conversations, but we're also starting now to look at larger things, because out of those few columns that we've done have come larger questions about funding and inclusivity, stuff like that. So it's sort of building on itself. It's hard because we're all part-time.
Sure.
But, I think I've only been doing this for a year, so we're sort of planning some larger issues, which is something that I didn't get to do at the Inquirer. They do mostly profiles and kind of, profiles, interviews, puff pieces kind of stuff, and reviews. And we don't do really any of that. We do review and opinion, period. So it's a very different beast.
That's great. And John, it's interesting because what you're saying resonates a little bit with what John was telling me, who John's mother wrote the Denver Post, right? Had a section that every week or every month? Every week, the different counties would get a different insert that was written by local reporters, so it was uber local to their suburb, which is really interesting. And so it's resonating with me that you're saying that going local is what's getting you more readership and getting people to talk more. And I guess your scope is slightly narrower in terms of what you write about now because you're writing with the support of the Denver Center. Is that true? Or?
Yeah. It's unlike anything anybody else has tried, and it's still an experiment in progress. But I do got to tell you, I'm the death of print. The slow, agonizing death of print it kills me, because I did grow up with a mother and a father are both reporters, and I have the black ink of newspapers running in my veins, and I think the hardest part about it has been on my nose, because I don't smell it as that print as much anymore. But I'll tell you one good thing about not working for print anymore is the ability when you realize that you've spelled something wrong and you just call it up and you get to fix it,
Right.
and it's gone.
That always fix it.
I don't have copy editors anymore. That's a big thing. I don't have a John. I don't have an editor. So I thought I used to be a pretty clean writer until I became a writer without an editor. That's humbling, very much so. But I think what we're trying to do is, by presenting me as a shared asset for the whole Colorado theater communities, we're trying to be an answer to the continuing diminishment of arts jobs in the local media, and that's kind of the bigger issue, I think. I don't write reviews anymore, but I would say, for the purposes of this conversation, the biggest effect that the fact that there are no more full-time arts writers at the Denver Post anymore, and there is a big proliferation of writers who contribute online and in blogs and things like that, is that what we've had what I would call like this acidic sea of sunshine and bad grammar, and there's suddenly, if you followed the theater community in Colorado by just looking at Facebook or using online as a barometer, you would think that Denver was the greatest theater city in the world, because nothing's not the best show that you've ever seen in your life. And I think part of that is economic. I think the losing full-time committed arts writers means you've lost somebody who has an investment in maintaining a consistent artistic bar for the community. No one who is contributing as a freelancer or has with a blog has any sort of economic incentive to be tough. Yep. Because, for one thing, a lot of these writers do it just for love of theater, which is great, and so they're inclined to be positive anyway. But those who do have any kind of pay structure, their pay is dependent on how many hits they get. And because you have to get a certain number of hits before you even get $1 from what used to be the Examiner, then no company's going to recirculate your link if you're going to be tough on people, because nobody wants to see that. But so if the only way people are going to get paid is if they're overly praiseful, suddenly we have nothing but Tony-winning theater in Denver, and I really regret that for the readers. I was always a champion of the arts in Denver, but I think I had I had a high artistic bar, and I know that was hard, and it was something that you had to live with. But readers would thank me for holding theaters to a high standard because of the economics of theater, the fact that you don't have a lot of discretionary income, and being able to say, you might want to skip this one, is just as useful, and it's just as helpful to the theater, because you're not doing anybody any favors by sending stuff to mediocre theater, because they're going to think you don't have a good artistic eye. They're not going to come back to that theater to give them another chance. And so I think there's this weird kind of grave stomping that goes on over the death of the media, especially with the political landscape that we live in right now. If the media just completely went away, there would be a lot of people who'd be really happy about that. We would suffer in many, many different ways if that were to become a reality, but that also includes arts enthusiasts as well, because I've learned as I've gone on that as hard as it is, you need somebody to be tough.
And
I answered your question.
You did. I have one follow-up, if you don't mind. So, and I thank you so much, because a lot of this is one of the things that we've been talking about in Philly specifically. So I know a lot of us have been having these conversations, both online and Broad Street Review in person, about needing to hold up the standards. But then, how does it affect you that you're now paid by the Denver Center? So I know you don't review, but how does that affect what you can do?
It does affect what I do. I mean, I'm very transparent about what I do now. I've entered into a new phase of my career. I am now I wouldn't say purely, I'm an advocacy journalist. Okay. I now work for the nonprofit world. I work for the Denver Center. My job is to build the buzz. My job is to interview. The thing, though, that I would take exception when, it is gray, but I still approach an interview with a playwright or any other advanced story that I write with the same critical eye that I would about what would be worthy of being in the Denver Post. on Sunday, because what I found and what the Denver Center has actually found with this mission is that you can get people to come to your theater with slick TV ads, with coupon offers or whatever, but you know what? Content, intelligent journalistic content is another sales tool as well. Some people don't want a coupon. They want to have an interview with the playwright, and you can actually talk about, so that they know what the actual play is about, and say, oh, this is about immigration. This is what I'm concerned with right now. And after reading this interview with this playwright, I have to go see what they've written about. The readership of the Denver Post are the exact same people who are the potential audience for the Denver Center for the Performing Arts. So when I was writing for the Post and I interviewed a playwright and it was a particularly provocative interview, if the theater called me back up the next Monday and said, wow, thanks, our phones are ringing off the hook, I'd go, okay, great, that wasn't my job, but I'm glad that it worked. But it meant that I had written something that was provocative enough for people to go pick up the phone or go online and order some tickets to find out for themselves. And essentially that's what I'm doing now. I've just cut out the reviews, but not just for the Denver Center, but because I still cover all the other major theater companies and smaller theater companies around town, the fact of the matter is I still am the only full-time theater journalist in Colorado, and the coverage that I give companies that 5 years ago somebody might have looked at it and said, but aren't they your competition? And the Denver Center has said, no, the rising tide floats all boats. We need to get people to know what's happening in the local arts community, and that means the theater that's down the street and in the mountains. And if people read those stories and they buy tickets to the other theaters companies, that's great. And if as long as I'm writing with the same sort of integrity that I approached any story that I was at the Post, I feel relatively clean about it. And I think my hate mail has just diminished considerably, and I don't miss that. So I don't know if that.
No, thank you so much. So from advocacy journalistic writing to you have been an editor, and you don't need this.
Oh, I keep doing that.
Yeah, you don't want to hear this more than once. Yeah.
And longtime writer for Philadelphia Inquirer. We've all been reading you for years. So how do you see the world changing because you're still in print?
Yeah. Well, the Inquirer is changing really fast. And we are not a newspaper anymore. We're a website that puts out a newspaper. The newspaper is really important and makes almost all of our money, and a couple 100,000 people want a physical newspaper on their porch, and of course we throw it into the flowers, but you usually can find it. At any rate, we have this weird thing, which is that a lot of people still want the newspaper, and we still have to make one, and we still deliver it, and so there's a thing that we make. And that sort of hasn't changed a lot. The thing that's changed about it is there's about 5 of us. I mean, we have nobody. I mean, the crickets are, there is nobody in the halls. So all of us have like 5 jobs, and you would be amazed when you see the newspaper, and there's a beautiful newspaper coming out every morning. It looks like there's 700 people like there were when I first got there. There aren't. There's about 150 now, and that includes all of the fronts. So, it's baling wire and spit all the way. Meantime, what we really are is a website that puts out a newspaper. We are owned by a foundation. We have triple stream revenue source, which means that we, have people who subscribe. The paywall is going pretty well, actually. We got a Trump bump, like a lot of newspapers did, and that has stayed steady. But we also have the foundation, which owns us and gives us money, but they don't want to hear from us. We have to prosper on our own. They don't want to hear from us, so they've given us money. Buy Junior, don't write back for money. You got it. And then the other thing is advertisers. The advertisers are the problem. Actually, nobody knows the answer to this. Advertisers don't advertise online very much. They don't trust online. It's changing a little bit, but not impressively. And all the middle ground advertisers that used to advertise in newspapers are dying. So we have
middle ground. What do you mean middle ground?
Well, like the used car lots, right, and the shopping centers and all the places that used to advertise in newspapers in Philly.
Well, that used to be classifieds. Classifieds are what kept the papers going for
absolutely
years.
Right.
And
absolutely
Craigslist
right.
came along, and we're all bankrupt.
Oh yeah, I mean, but those advertisers also globally are diminishing. Yeah. I mean, they actually, as a group of advertisers, are getting smaller, and so the amount of buys that you get are small. And online, the amount of buys are minuscule compared to print. It's so weird to think about this, that of course we have to go to the web where there is no money. But we have to go there because advertising revenue for print is declining. So what does this mean for us?
Right, how does that shape your content? Like what you decide to report on?
Okay, so it does shape it a lot. A couple of years ago when I was made the editor of All Things Arts, which I only did for a year, and I agreed to do it for a year, but it was crazy. You know, we all agreed that the thing we had to do was we had to dedicate ourselves to people knowing that there's an art scene. Just the baseline is, a lot of people don't know how much great theater there is in Philadelphia. There's the storefront theater community in this city is extraordinarily vibrant. And as I was telling you while we were sitting out there in the sort of wine and cheese moment, is, you know, there's so many people in this city who would really love what's going on the stages. They just don't go. Yeah. And, you know, what can we do? Because we've got it, theater is not the only place it has to happen. It also has to happen with classical music. Yeah. I mean, you know, think about what the Philadelphia Orchestra, the most famous orchestra in the world, and, you know, when they go to when they go to Europe or they go to China, they pack the houses. People cannot get in enough. You know, they're having trouble. They're having trouble because everybody is 3,000 years old. You know, they go there, they love the music. You know, theater's the same way. Is that the funding source for that is aging out. How do you get the people who should be coming, because they should? There's so much edgy stuff going on talking about right now. You know, how do you break the wall down?
So thinking about who your readership is and the advertisers that you are trying desperately to keep, does that mean that you tend to pick content based on who you think those advertisers are interested in, or do you pick, because there's so much to cover, you can't cover everybody?
You don't do that. You know, there's got to be a wall between you and the advertisers.
Right.
Have to say, the wall doesn't exist anymore, and I'm constantly going into meetings.
Which is what I've heard.
Yeah,
so how does it affect actually who you choose to cover? Because you can't cover everybody. We have all these wonderful artists.
Right. Well, you can't do everything.
Yeah.
And some of it is sort of just, you know, like that. But I mean, to be honest, we look at the things that are big gets for Philly. Mm-hmm. We look at the things that are emblematic of where Philly theater is going, and we try to concentrate on those. But we also have sort of a spotty but consistent dedication to getting out in the burbs a little bit, because some of the smaller theaters out in the burbs ought to get some love. We don't have much money. I don't have much freelance money. I'm doing more reviews personally than ever before. I think I'm probably going to be going out nightly, like you do, you know, which has, you know, not been the case for our theater critic in a long time. But we're looking at things that are emblematic, things that can make news as news. Okay. So a lot of things don't get covered, even though they might be deserving. Yeah.
And how have you seen this scene shift? And I'm also curious to hear, what he had not talked about is that he is the O'Neill. You train critics.
Yes,
the O'Neill
no jobs.
You train critics?
He does. So I'm also curious
Get out there and die.
Not only how has the industry changed since you've been here, but what are you telling the next generation? Where do you see this going for arts writing?
Well, you know, there's so many complex issues here. John is a very smart guy, and a lot of what he said is right on. I mean, if you take emblematically, if you look at a town like Cincinnati, let's just talk about Cincinnati, which has a Gannett newspaper, Cincinnati Enquirer. In the lifetime of everybody in this room, within the last decade, they used to have a rock critic, a jazz critic, a classical critic, a food critic, a visual art critic, a theater critic, a dance critic. They had about 11 full-time cultural writers. They just fired the last one about 2 weeks ago. And so there are no critics in Cincinnati. There are no critics in Cleveland to speak of. There used to be Atlanta. There's these great swaths of America that have no critics. So there's a couple at the New York Times. Yep. There's a couple at the Washington Post. There's me in the Midwest. I'm kind of it in the Midwest almost. There's one in San Francisco, Charlie in LA. Right. There's I know them all. There's 10 of us left, 10 to 12 of us. That's it. In terms
like
of
the daughter party.
In terms
eating
of
each other.
Going to start eating each other.
You know, in terms of those jobs. This has contributed to the clear diversity problem in criticism, which is largely driven by the fact that no one has been hired. So therefore, people talk about that issue. It's mostly because the same old white people who've been in the jobs are still in the jobs. And if they were to leave, there would be no jobs.
There wouldn't be replaced.
So that is the sort of the agony that we all find ourselves in. And so there's that. Now, can I worry about that on a daily basis? Well, it's hard. But on the other hand, online is not kind to reviews. We don't work for charities. I work for a for-profit business, so they know exactly how many people read every review that I write. We can down to the number of people. For years, criticism had an adjacency issue. So what would happen is you'd be reading the sports coverage in the Post, say, and you'd find Riedel's column right next to it, and you'd be like, oh, that's interesting. Riedel's interesting. That's an interesting story about Frank Rich. That's interesting. But you hadn't set out to go there. The problem online more is that anyone who comes to a panel like this can find it. But those are not enough numbers to please the people who essentially
Exactly. So with the Inquirer, they count everything. Yeah.
So that's a sort of a challenge. I think I survived because people over 50, people over 40, people over 40 still read the paper. And there is a dovetail, if you look around this room, there is a dovetail of people over 40 with people who go to the theater and are interested in the theater. And so I have this loyal, and it's not small, it's in the hundreds of thousands, brand
But shrinking,
but dying, but still there, of readers who do, in fact, if Chris Jones says go to a show, they roll themselves out and they go, and the theaters are happy that they go, and they fill a lot of seats, and what little power I have comes from them doing it. Now, that's just the reality. So there's that. So you're dealing with all of that, and then you've got the daily grind, if you like, of the instant feedback loop that now exists. So used to be you'd write a review, get one angry phone call, you move on to the next review. Now everyone's a critic, everyone dissects the critic. There's a lot more, I would say a lot more people say you think this because of who you are, which I don't think people said so much quite a decade ago, which always annoys me on some level, frankly, because I'm always like, well, I like to think of I am who I am, and that's not a secret, but I've been going every night. This is my job and my life, and so I like to think that I can get past who I am a little more than some people think that I can get past who I am.
Isn't it weird to be blamed for what you are suddenly?
Well, there is that. So I try and start
You're
with
a critic. People are supposed to hate you.
Right. I try and start with the artwork and sort of go from there and try and see the artwork in its own terms. There's still interest in it, and I think you have to write. What I told to answer your question, you have to write about life. You have to attract readers, and this man is very good at this. You have to attract readers who would not otherwise be reading what it is you have to say. Yeah. That is the number one thing you've got to do, and you have to get them in the first paragraph. Otherwise, they're not reading it, or they're clicking elsewhere. You have to write for readers, and it's not necessarily what the theater community wants you to write. John is right, though, about the agony of the positive review doing better, because it is widely shared. If you write something positive about Lin-Manuel Miranda, and he happens to tweet it to his 7 million followers, where I work, some suit walks in your office like, oh, Chris Jones, that's 500,000 readers on that piece. And I'm like, oh, yeah, Lynn retweeted it, great. Then you feel like...
I didn't like Hamilton, that's why my career's over with.
So then you feel like you want to take a bath, you can't be... So you just have to, you have to have that integrity to sort of get past that, I guess. And another thing that John said that's very true is that the full-time person is advocating, if you're in the office, you're there going, wait, don't cut that, that's an important show. You've got to have somebody there going, the arts matter. Because there's Philistines everywhere you go. People don't understand how important the arts are. Newspapers, half of them don't know. 90% of them don't give a damn. So you've got to be in there, in the trenches going, yes, yes, yes. And of course, the people in the theater community never understand that. So I get ticked off about that too. So those are all my bitter resentments.
Well, good. I'm glad that we'll send you a therapy dog.
I mean, I managed to survive all these years when all my friends who were critics
Died.
they got laid off, they died, they became ushers. But, you know, I was not interested in being a critic. I was interested in, because I wasn't a crazy theater person, I wasn't a fan of the theater, but I got interested in the people who had the power in the theater, the people who really controlled things, the people who owned the theaters, the people who ran the big agencies, the powerful producers. So those are the people that I covered. And something happened in the 30 or so years I've been doing this, that when I was a kid, if you had to be a really nerdy person in love with the movies to pick up Variety to find the box office grosses.
Yes, that's right.
But over the last 30 years, the business of show business became gigantic. That may be attributable to the rise of something like Entertainment Tonight back in the day. But suddenly what was going on behind the scenes became interesting to people. And that's what I had been doing for a long time. I'd been telling you that the leading lady was fighting with the producer, that the investors were concerned that the show was not making money, that Julie Taymor was out of control on Spider-Man, that Rosie O'Donnell was emasculating her entire creative team on Taboo. For me, this is what I've always been doing. And suddenly that became more compelling, more dramatic, more engaging than yet another review. And what we saw happen when we went online, as they've said, you can tell instantly what works and what doesn't. And reviews, at least in my paper, the New York Post, at the New York Daily News, did not work. And I don't just mean for the theater. Movie reviews don't work the way they once worked.
Nope.
People now go to Rotten Tomatoes, and you get 4 tomatoes, and they see the movie. They don't need Roger Ebert. They don't need Gene Siskel, although they began it with thumbs up and thumbs down. But they backed it up with good opinions and good writing in their newspapers and good personalities on television. Once your employer sees that nobody is reading what you're writing, you will be fired. It's as simple as that, because it's a business that we're in. Now, my column does not generate the hits that, let us say, my penis used to be a vagina article will do, because 8 million people will read that, and that will come from some strange news source in Australia that we've never even heard of before, but they come up with these weird but true stories that are gigantic. But still enough people read my column, and enough people in the theater think that it has an impact, that they will buy ads around it online and in the paper. But economically, where the papers die is that when the Philadelphia Inquirer was the dominant paper in this town, let us say in the late 80s and 90s, before the internet, if Cameron McIntosh came to Philadelphia with Les Miserables, he had to take out gigantic ads in the Sunday section of the paper and pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for those ads. Now on the internet, he can go to places, he himself can target everybody who is going to buy a ticket for that show, and he can do it for a lot less money.
Through analytics, yeah.
And so he does not have to spend the hundreds of thousands of dollars in the newspapers that still have to pay for the pension funds, for the truck drivers, and the pressmen, and all these old costs from another era that the advertising dollars do not support. And that is the end of newspapers.
So Chris especially, but for anyone else, because Chris or not. But like for those of you who've talked to the future arts writers, what do you tell them? Where do you see this with all this economic demise going? What do you say?
I do think, though, in some ways the pressure is on us to be really, really good writers. We can be engaging or controversial. We have to be good writers because if you write a column that is fun or sassy, controversial, whatever it is, has news is very important. To break stories is important. Unfortunately, the scoop lasts 30 seconds because everyone else picks it up, and now they used to credit you. Now I've noticed they stopped crediting you.
Right.
But if you have a voice, if you have a muscularity to your writing, if you have a reputation, a brand name, if you will, you can survive. I'm not sure how long, but you can survive. If you look on all these chat boards, there are a zillion chat boards out there now where people go and everyone has an opinion about this. But it was interesting to me that, I don't know if he's still writing, but when this thing called All That Chat came online and everybody was reading it, there was one person who rose to the top. Jesse21, his name was.
Right.
Why did he rise to the top? Because he was reviewing the plays before the Ben Brantleys of the world went to it. And he had their taste. So he became important because if he likes it, that means the other big critics that we know are probably going to like it. So he rose to the top of this sea of cacophony through his opinions, the way he wrote them, and his taste. And I think no matter what the delivery system is, whether it's a newspaper or online or on your phone, whatever it is, if somebody comes along in the theater who has the style and muscularity of Frank Rich or who can be controversial, such as I am, people will read it.
The problem is, though, with those new voices is it sustainable if no one is there to hire that person to make it their profession?
Jesse21 works for an insurance company, so get another job and on the side, write reviews.
Yeah.
So they'd be like artists.
But I got to say, though, I don't think any of us is entitled to a living. I mean, Chris and I talk about this a lot. We have a lot of friends in the journalism profession who just believe that they're entitled to a living. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the free market system. If people don't buy what you're selling, you have to find something else to do. It's simple as that.
Is that what you tell the students who come to the O'Neill?
Well, a couple of my...
Just out of
couple of them are out
curiosity.
there.
Nobody ever lets me come to the O'Neill.
No, everybody, I think the number one thing is you've got to write about a lot of different things. The idea that you can make a living, full-time living writing about the theater is over. You have to be able to diversify.
Absolutely.
I mean, to some degree, what Michael's talking about is a process of deprofessionalization, which is not that different from if you're a taxi driver. I wrote this column the other week about I was standing outside the Four Seasons in Chicago, and I was eavesdropping. There was a woman with a doorman, and the doorman was trying to hail her a cab, and there were no cabs. And this guy was trying harder and harder to hail this woman a cab. And she finally said to him, she said, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to take an Uber. And his face kind of fell, because he was thinking, surely, will there be doormen if there are no cabs anymore? And he said, it's okay, like that. I'm sorry, it's okay. And I'm sitting there going,
That's me.
It's that moment. It's that moment of of deprofessionalization, and frankly, it's affecting the theater. There's an argument that people in 50 years going to sit passively in one of these seats while somebody tells a story in which they are not involved? Some people would argue no. There will at minimum be fewer of those experiences because the arts are going through a great process of democratization. Now everyone's a musician. Everyone has access to the technology that would have been that most of us in this room would never have had access to. There's a great interest in personal involvement in storytelling. So a lot of the theater that's doing very well today somehow engages people in their own narrative, right? Which is quite different from, say, the plays, if you look in this lobby, that have been the hallmark of this theater for a long time. You have to deal. I was at actually a conference on this, and I was talking about this issue with somebody, one of these great thinkers in the arts, and I said, well, what would you say to what would you say to Page? What would you say to the artistic director of a theater? And his answer was, open source everything. People want everything to be open source, but to some degree that fights with the whole notion of what an artistic director is, or what a critic is, which is I'm saying, don't you decide what's good, trust me. And it's tricky today. it's just tricky. The world is spinning in all these complicated ways.
And what do you tell, Wendy, you're kind of known for mentoring young arts writers at Broad Street Review, which is wonderful because you're bringing them up in a way that no other publication can or will. What do you say to them, to those young arts writers that you're mentoring?
Yeah, I mean, they all have a day job, you know, and that's really what they're in. One of them is an editor at a medical publishing place. I say, you know, maybe go into academia, dramaturgy, but then, of course, academia has its own problems with the adjunct professors. So, I mean, it's a really difficult situation. I tell them that you have to have a day job. This is not a job that you can do anymore. So I don't really, I'm sorry, have any more hopeful recommendations.
Do you have thoughts? Yeah.
Well, sort of. Before we go, I just want to bring this back in a way to the effect that this has on the art, and also to tie a little bow on the show that you're going to see tonight, and what Mike Daisy has to say about all this. Because I brought a quote, and I just had, as soon as I saw it, I said, I got to read this quote. I've had the opportunity to interview several members of this panel in my job, and I got an opportunity to interview Mike Daisy. And there's a little hook at the end of this. So this is what Mike Daisy had to say about all this. He said, theater is deeply interdependent on the newspaper industry. Theater critics have been an integral part of theater's identity for more than a century, woven into the core rituals of opening night, previews, and so forth. With the current model of newspapers collapsing, we will lose that support system of critical feedback, and it will strike a deep blow to the theater's sense of itself as a relevant art form. The media that replaces and evolves from newspapers are unlikely to give theater as much attention as it's getting now, and the loss of advertising space will mean theater needs to actually think about how to reach people. It will be a difficult transition that theaters are poorly equipped to handle. Now, my little hook on that is, this interview was in 2009. And that's what Mike Daisy had to say about this, all of which is to say, I think we should pay attention to what he has to say tonight.
Yes. So we have a few minutes left. Were there any questions from the audience that you wanted to raise? And does someone have a mic? No. So we're going to speak loud, and we'll. Yes.
We've got one. Yes.
Awesome. So there was 1, 2, 3, right in a row.
You're right there.
Yeah.
First row seats at the best row.
Yes.
I have a cousin who writes for the Washington Post who says that every year the average age of a newspaper reader gets a year older. I wonder about the demographics of the online arts coverage, if you've managed to reverse that trend.
Can I address that?
Yeah.
Just real briefly, because we are in the era of analytics, one of the things that's most encouraging about the mission that we're doing is that the breakdown of readership of the content that we're doing is exactly even for all of the age groups. If you do it by decades, from 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and above 60s, it's about 20% each, which shocks the analytic people at the Denver Center. That there are older people who are using the computer, and B, that there are younger people reading about theater.
I'll just say that, yes, we mostly have younger readers now. We didn't used to, but I think our largest group is like in the 20-something to 30-something group. So that's really encouraging, and I think a lot of that is because of our engagement on social media. So that's really brought us. Yeah, I mean, and that's brought, and unfortunately, people don't click around or they stay on for about a minute, read their article, and move on. But that's, because we keep posting articles and engaging with people who, might be interested, then we're getting a lot of younger readers now.
But every single one of us up here, we are completely beholden to Google and Facebook, because most of the traffic online does not come from our home pages. It comes from Google and Facebook. And if they change their analytics as they do, you can see a complete collapse in your traffic. These are the forces that are deciding what you read today.
Amen.
And I don't think Mark Zuckerberg was a big Jerry Herman fan.
Could I just ask a local question? I saw Phantom of the Opera opening night in Philadelphia, and there was 18 in the orchestra pit, 40 people on stage, great scenery sets, and the review didn't appear for a week in the Inquirer. And I can only imagine in New York if the reviews were a week after the opening, which brings me also, should critics review preview performances?
No, they should not.
They are. The New York
No,
Times.
we
The New
don't-
York Times
we
went
don't
out
do
of
it.
town to review Frozen in Denver.
Yeah, but we don't do it.
And how important are reviews to the box office of a show? Because I've seen some great reviews of New York shows, of shows I loved, that just didn't last but a couple months.
Well, I think that's a great question. Our review is $1 million question. Our review is important to the box office. I think most people in the theater would say that they are still. And I think they are. If you look at, say, The Band's Visit on Wednesday, which I saw, they just opened on Broadway this week, which is a good show. It's not a show that's going to sell. It is wholly dependent. If that had got bad reviews, it would be closed by now. Yeah. It is wholly dependent on reviews. Are there brands like Frozen, which is, probably not going to be great based on what we saw in Denver, but probably going to be okay? That will be fine. It depends on how strong the brand is, but it's a bit like the indie movie really needs reviews, and still does. And the challenging art, the art that's risky, those are, I still, God damn it, it still matter. We still matter. And that I do feel that they do still, they do, people go, Claudia Cassidy, who was a Tribune critic from the 40s, famously said, the only power a critic has is if people act on their reviews. It's as simple as that. If people don't act on their reviews, then you're wasting your time. If you can guarantee that people will go if you say go and not go if you say don't go, then you have what? Passage for power, which in our business, power is what keeps our jobs. So, my nightmare is when people go to a show I liked and write to me and tell me it sucked.
Yeah.
I'm like, and they'll say, I'll never trust you again. That's the worst, because too many of those and you're out of business, right? Or the converse. So I just try and not let people down in the hope that they will listen to me. I try to say if it's good, and, that's the thing. You've got to get in the mind of the reader, the audience member. And it's difficult because...
And that's a total change, because the old critics I knew were so arrogant. They were like, I don't care what the reader thinks. I'm with the New York Times. I don't care. The reader's opinion is not... The reader's an idiot. I'm a genius. Now they're like saying, my God, you got to take a survey of the readers to know what to say.
Just for the Inquirer, one thing we do track, and one of the nicest numbers that we have, is that there's a direct knock-on effect between reviews and audience attendance. And strangely enough, my column, which is a fairly new column, if I mention a play in the column, they get a bump. And I know this. I know mostly anecdotally, but not all the way anecdotally. We actually do track this. And so, strangely enough, there is this sort of this. Also, I might add that for national tours. Places like the Kimmel have to have reviews, or else the tours won't sign up again next year. So there's actually a structural importance for reviews that happen for all cities. I think that's true. If you don't review something, the people who decide where to go next year and how to shape the tour might not go back to your city. So, there are these things to be considered.
John, I will expect you at every opening night at Philadelphia Theater. Thank you so much. We have time for two more. Two more. Over here.
I produced a documentary about 10 years ago called The Critics, Stories from the Inside Pages. And I made the argument in there that the best critics don't do so much reviewing as they do critical thinking. That they do synthesis and analysis and putting things together for the viewer. And do you see that as part of your job? And actually, I'm working on a documentary right now on cell phone addiction, and I'm finding that people read far less, because they read little snippets from their cell phones, and that's where they get their information. And how's that impacting your business?
That's an excellent, I think most great plays are about death and about how we're taken from the planet at a time and place not of our own choosing, and without regard to deserving. So that's what most plays are about. And I think the most good critics write about life and death a lot of the time, or write about stuff on that level. And I think that's right. But you've got to get them reading the piece to begin with. That's the dilemma. You've got to get the readers in there to sort of engage with it. And one of the problems, so on Broadway, right, a lot of the shows are things that people already know. Yeah. So Frozen, people, it's what's the word? Pre-awareness is everything. Pre-awareness, and no one buys a ticket to something they don't know. The problem with a review is that if you're reviewing an unknown play, you have to hook that reader into the review, even though they don't know what it is. And it is really, really hard, I find, but imperative for the survival of the new American play. But it's really hard.
But what I think you're good at, and a reviewer like Peter Marks in Washington, and Frank Rich was great at, was that you guys also are reporters. So you're not just analyzing the play. You write a review that says something, an event took place last night in the theater, and it is newsworthy because. Yeah. Right. Now, maybe newsworthy because it's a colossal failure, and you write a hilarious review destroying it. Right. Or you say, I saw a new play that you've never heard of before called Angels in America that you must see because the landscape of the culture will change. So you have to, as a critic, especially in a newspaper, I think, have that reporter's hat on, where you make the play feel not just another play I'm reviewing, but a news event that happened in the theater last night. And you have to bring energy and muscularity to the writing about it to engage the reader. Right.
And how do you respond to having to shrink it down? Because that's like to put on a Twitter feed or to put on a Facebook.
Well, I mean, that really is the end of criticism. I mean, if you're going to write one line on Snapchat or InstaChat or whatever they call these things, then it's over. I mean, that is just
click through, like to have people click through.
Headlines. We all have headlines. Yeah. Headlines were the thing that grabbed readers. Yeah. So you have to have special headlines online. I mean, I had a big fight with an editor the other day for a headline.
That's the least surprising statement anyone's.
I wrote a story about rude audience behavior, bad audience behavior, and I interviewed some actor friends of mine. They've got all funny stories and whatnot. But on the whole, audiences are not total pigs yet. And my editor said, this is how audiences are destroying Broadway. I said, that's a little extreme. And I made the case. I went to a play the other night, and the audience was respectful, and they were engaged in the evening and respectful to the actors. They still ran with a headline, how audiences are destroying Broadway. 500,000 clicks. I'm going to argue against that? No. From now on, everything I write is going to have something is destroying something in the title, and leave it at that.
All right, we have time for one more, and this woman who's been writing furiously here is going to have something for you.
So a lot of this conversation has actually been around the locus of how the industry has changed, and appreciate the tension that creates. And what I'm hearing, which is that it has to hits the pressure of headline and hits, and that simply even if you're writing really well like that. So what it's sounding like is kind of a bottom line. To compare it to the way a business is run. And I'm wondering, even if that is the case, because you're people in the world who have to deal with that, if that's your outer container around which you relate, are there any other lines that you are towing, and what are they? And are they getting eaten away because of this changing outside context?
Just say that slightly different way.
You've been talking about hits, right? Yes. Headlines.
Yeah.
Getting people. So that's a bottom line of success equals reach, or success equals preservation of my job. Which I'm not, there's no judgment there, but I'm wondering beyond that, is that protecting another bottom line or another reason to do it? Are you finding that you're spending more energy trying to get the hits, trying to get the headlines? Or what else is there other than that?
So is this mad search for clicks and hits
Right.
warping how we write
The
and
art
think.
of the criticism.
Yeah.
The art of the criticism.
You know what? I leave it to my editors who say, something is destroying something. They know how to do it. I don't. I just deliver the column and I let them worry about it.
It's an art in and of itself.
Headline writing always has been an art at newspapers.
Yeah.
Ignoring the content of the article has also been an art for headline
For editors.
So, it's one
Listen,
of the...
back, the Post had this great headline in the 70s before the internet even existed when they found a corpse that's head had been cut off in a strip club, and it was headless body found in topless bar.
Yes.
That would get a gazillion clicks today.
Gazillion
So
clicks.
some things change, and in many ways they don't.
Did you have a thought?
Yeah, I mean, I for me, I mean, I'm lucky in that we're owned by or run by a foundation, so I'm not in as much, it's not as much pressure to generate clicks for money, although there's a little. But I will say that for me, the important thing is sort of keeping this journalistic standard going for freelancers, because it's disappearing so quickly. So we had an issue here in Philly where a playwright said that they didn't want critics to review, and to
Yes.
me,
It was not me.
it was
No, it wasn't you. It wasn't you. It drove me crazy.
It was not at all.
It's crazy.
And so to me, it was imperative that we went and we reviewed that show. Because it wasn't a preview, it wasn't in tryouts, anything like that. It was a real show and a real production with an up-and-coming playwright who should be, whose play should be covered for the record. And I had the experience when I was in grad school of, the papers that I researched about theater, I researched, reception studies a little bit, and that was, and where I went for that was theater reviews, throughout history. And so, I have like a real firsthand understanding of the importance of reviews as record, as historic record. And so for me, that's something that's really front and center. Aside from just getting the clicks, it's just having, being there and bearing witness and, saying what happened on that stage that night, and how it was received by our critic, and that's super important to me. So that's sort of one of the lines that I do.
Yep, then we have to wrap it up because some of you may be going to the show tonight and some of you may be going to other theaters.
Yeah, I think John has. Did you?
I just want to say that when I go to talk to aspiring critics at colleges, I say 4 things. I say learn all the arts. Don't expect to be a theater critic. Learn all the arts. Have all the tools. Have the 5 tools that I have so that you can sit down and build a website, take photographs, report from the field, write as though there's an event going on. First and foremost, always be a journalist. And the last thing is write the hell out of it. So that theater criticism has to be a subset of arts criticism, and it's all got to be the best writing you can find, no matter where it's at, whether it's on a sheet of paper or online.
And if you can get Trump or destroying the headline,
You win! Thank you all so much. Please thank our guests for coming. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Want to get involved with Broad Street Review? Head on over to our website at www.broadstreetreview.com and click Get Involved at the top. While you're there, help keep us running and click Contribute to find out how. Connect with us on social media on Facebook and Twitter at Broad Street Review. Thank you for helping to keep the conversation going.